So, Prince William and Princess Catherine are reportedly in tears on camera, and the heartbreaking reason they are finally giving for keeping young Prince Louis so completely out of the public eye is that an 8-year-old child actually started believing his own family was deeply ashamed of him. Not because of a terrifying health scare, not because of a credible security threat, and certainly not because of some complicated, archaic royal protocol, but simply because the overwhelming silence surrounding his absence got so incredibly loud that a little kid naturally filled in the blank spaces with the absolute worst possible answer. That is the devastating core of this entire story. And honestly, the more closely you look at the timeline and the specific way this delicate situation was handled behind closed doors, the more confusing and heartbreaking the whole thing gets. Before we dive into the details, if you are into royal deep dives and palace drama that actually makes sense when you slow it down and analyze it, please hit subscribe to my channel. It helps the channel significantly more than you know, and we are covering this kind of intricate royal stuff regularly. Okay, let us get into it. The big dramatic moment everyone is currently talking about is Catherine sitting down in front of a camera with a prepared, written statement resting in front of her, which is typically how the palace handles absolutely everything. Every single word is meticulously vetted by staff. Every sentence is legally cleared. Every pause is probably rehearsed multiple times. That is not a harsh criticism. That is just how Kensington Palace operates to survive the media cycle. They have been doing it this specific way for well over a decade. So, when Catherine reportedly looked down at the typed pages, paused heavily, and then deliberately placed them face down on the table, that single action is already a massively significant departure from protocol. And then she simply starts speaking from the heart about Prince Louis. No polished notes, no pre-approved lines, no frantic warning given to the hovering communications team. About 2/3 of the way through her unscripted monologue, while speaking about her youngest son, she visibly gets emotional. Tears clearly form in her eyes, yet her voice keeps going, not stopping, not asking the crew to pause the recording, just bravely speaking through the pain. And that is the specific detail that makes it feel so incredibly real, because if you have ever watched someone try desperately to hold it together while they are talking about their vulnerable child, you know how much harder that restraint is to watch than if they simply broke down completely. Now, the palace has spent years carefully building a very specific, controlled public image around these 3 children. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis typically appear in public only a handful of times a year. The traditional Christmas walk at Sandringham, the iconic Buckingham Palace balcony during Trooping the Colour, maybe a carefully selected family-friendly sporting event, and of course the birthday photos taken by Catherine herself. That has been the unwavering strategy since George was born back in 2013. It is not a sudden new thing. It is a highly structured 10-year plan, as the Scottish Daily Express previously described it, specifically designed to give them as normal a childhood as possible under extraordinary circumstances. And when you look closely at the history, you deeply understand why Prince William is so intensely protective about this strategy. He was merely 15 years old when he was forced to walk behind his mother's coffin in front of millions of grieving people. And then, immediately after Princess Diana's tragic death, her private letters were ruthlessly published, her handwriting was forensically examined by strangers, her iconic clothes were displayed and sold off, and private recordings of her voice that she never intended for anyone else to hear became public entertainment. William saw all of that invasive horror happen in real time as a vulnerable teenager. So when he firmly says he wants his children to have genuine privacy, he is not being difficult or unnecessarily secretive for no reason. He is directly responding to something deeply, permanently traumatic that he has never fully gotten over. That part of the story is completely, utterly understandable. But here is where the narrative gets incredibly weird and troubling. Over the last several months, Prince Louis quietly started disappearing from public events. not just skipping a couple of minor appearances, but consistently missing events that had previously been penciled into the royal family calendar. Two specific family occasions he had joyfully attended in previous years suddenly went ahead without his presence. No official explanation was given. The palace's standard response to inquiring reporters was the same short, polite, stonewalling line about family privacy. And at first, the respectful public accepted that excuse, but then the quiet months kept adding up, and eagle-eyed royal watchers started closely counting. Once people start counting how long it has been since they have seen an energetic 8-year-old prince, the rumors inevitably begin to swirl. And that is the tragic irony of the whole situation. The rigid strategy deliberately designed to prevent wild speculation ended up creating significantly more of it. Because when you stubbornly remove all factual information, people do not simply stop asking questions, they just start aggressively making up their own, often darker, answers. William's first reaction to the growing media murmurs, according to the claims, was to stubbornly shut everything down even tighter, cancel every upcoming public event involving Louis, flatly refuse to discuss the situation internally or externally, and make it abundantly clear that missing official royal engagements simply did not matter if it meant fiercely protecting his son, which again, any fiercely protective parent would deeply understand. But the senior advisors operating inside the palace reportedly warned him that this stonewalling approach would eventually backfire spectacularly, and they had a very specific recent historical reason for saying that. Back in early 2024, when Catherine herself disappeared from public duties for a period of time without much detailed explanation following her surgery, the prolonged silence created a massive media vacuum. And that dark vacuum got rapidly filled with wild, unhinged theories, some of them genuinely harmful and distressing, before the palace finally, reluctantly explained what was actually going on with her health. The seasoned advisors weren't asking William to cruelly expose his young son or reveal deeply private family matters. They were simply asking for a short, general statement that would give the beleaguered press office something concrete to point to, instead of repeatedly saying absolutely nothing at all. And from a purely strategic PR perspective, that advice makes total sense. When there is no official explanation, the public creates their own. And once that happens, the royal family loses control of the narrative entirely. But William stood firm. Month after agonizing month, he flatly refused every single PR suggestion. He absolutely wouldn't allow Louis's delicate situation to become a subject of public discussion while his young son was still so confused and frightened behind closed doors. And here is the part that is genuinely, heartbreakingly sad. The suffocating silence started negatively affecting the entire royal household. George, who was 13 at the time, became noticeably quieter, significantly more careful, and burdened with more responsibility. He was old enough to clearly know something was wrong, but too young to fully comprehend what was happening. Charlotte, who was 11, sharply noticed every quietly closed door, every adult conversation that abruptly shifted tone when she walked into a room, every staff member who suddenly found a convenient reason to leave. She intelligently put the scattered pieces together on her own, and she came surprisingly close to understanding the hidden truth. But instead of making the tense situation about herself, she started quietly leaving handwritten jokes beside Louis's bed. Not just once, but repeatedly. She brilliantly figured out that making him laugh, even for just a few precious minutes, briefly brought back the energetic, happy brother she knew. And later, after accidentally overhearing household staff quietly discussing the rapidly growing public attention, she bravely went to her mother and asked if strangers were currently worried about Louis. Then she asked a crushing question that absolutely no 11-year-old should have to ask: is Louis going to have to answer all of them? That is a young kid carrying an emotional weight she should never have been carrying, and it happened primarily because nobody adequately explained enough. She filled in the terrifying missing pieces herself. Meanwhile, Catherine was barely sleeping, silently carrying heavy fears she desperately didn't want William to see. And William was doing the exact same thing, masking his own deep worries because he fiercely wanted to protect Catherine. Neither of them fully realized they had both completely stopped talking honestly about how they truly felt inside. Long, grinding periods of stress don't always lead to loud, explosive arguments. Sometimes nothing dramatic happens at all. There are no angry, shouted words, no obvious, chilly physical distance. Instead, kindness slowly becomes quieter. Daily conversations become shorter. True feelings stay tightly hidden. Before long, they were living under the same roof while quietly carrying separate, crushing burdens. And right in the middle of all this unspoken tension was 8-year-old Louis, who was far too young to understand how the ruthless royal institution worked, but plenty old enough to notice when something felt drastically different at home. Anyone who has watched the royal family over the past 6 years knows what Louis is like. He is the lively kid who brings irrepressible life into every stiff, quiet room. He famously struggles to sit perfectly still during long, boring ceremonies. He pulls hilarious, funny faces at the cameras. He asks endless, curious questions. He fills every single moment with vibrant energy. His playful, sometimes defiant expressions have ended up on newspaper front pages globally, looking like they would have made his late great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, raise an amused eyebrow. But then, abruptly, everything changed. As the youngest of the 3 children, Louis was never truly expected to carry the same heavy institutional weight as George or Charlotte. People constantly talked about George's future as king. They endlessly discussed Charlotte's eventual supporting role, but Louis was simply allowed to enjoy being a relatively normal child. That was one of the kindest, smartest decisions his parents ever made. But it also tragically meant nobody had adequately prepared him for what was about to happen. One day, he simply stopped going to public places. No one fully explained why. What he noticed wasn't a formal meeting or a difficult sit-down conversation. It was something much quieter and more insidious. The house became significantly quieter. The adults frequently lowered their voices. The very atmosphere changed. Little by little, even young Louis could profoundly feel that something wasn't right, and that growing, suffocating silence led to the emotional night when everything finally came to the surface. It happened late, after the children had gone to bed, and it was a deeply private conversation between William and Catherine. Catherine had painstakingly written her own public statement by hand over several emotional sessions on loose sheets of paper. She gently placed those pages on the table in front of William and quietly asked him to read them. Right beside her heartfelt, handwritten pages was the palace's official sterile draft. And this is where the story gets really fascinating regarding palace operations. A palace-approved statement is carefully, surgically written by royal advisors before it is ever released to the public. Every single word is chosen with intense legal and PR care. The ultimate goal is to say just enough to satisfy the press without creating any new questions or starting fresh, damaging headlines. But Catherine deeply felt something vital was missing. To her, those carefully written, approved words felt incredibly empty. They talked vaguely about the situation without ever admitting how truly frightening it had actually been. They spoke breezily about things getting better, but never truly explained what the family had actually gone through. The official statement sounded perfectly safe, but it did not sound real, and that was the specific part she simply could not accept. William slowly read the first line of Catherine's highly personal version. Before he even reached the second line, he shook his head in disagreement. He firmly reminded her that once a deeply personal message is made public, it never truly disappears from the internet. It can be shared again and again, ruthlessly picked apart, and constantly quoted out of context for years. He pointedly asked if she was truly ready to see strange people who had never even met Louis talking intimately about him for the rest of his natural life. As he passionately spoke, his voice became louder, but halfway through his forceful sentence, he suddenly stopped. That was the crucial moment they both realized something profound. The anger they were hearing in his voice was not really anger at all. It was raw, naked fear hiding defensively behind strong, protective words. Even so, Catherine steadfastly refused to back down, and this is where the whole conversation took a shocking, unexpected turn. She quietly, painfully told William that Louis had started believing he was being kept away from the public because his own family was deeply ashamed of him. Think about the sheer tragedy of that for a second. Not because he was sick, not because anything was fundamentally wrong with him, but because at just 8 years old, he had astutely noticed that he was always the one who stayed behind. He saw everyone else going out in their fine clothes while he remained hidden at home. No one clearly explained why. Whenever he walked into a room, adult conversations suddenly changed topic. People became noticeably quieter. Like many intelligent children would, he filled in the confusing missing pieces himself. A child who is never given a clear answer will usually create a narrative. The answer Louis created was absolutely heartbreaking. He convinced himself that he was the problem. That was the painful, unintended result of years of trying to fiercely protect him. The very plan meant to keep him safe from the media had slowly made him question his own fundamental worth. Catherine then pushed the palace's official, sterile draft across the table. She firmly told William there was absolutely nothing in those carefully chosen PR-approved words that sounded anything like the little boy they had nearly watched lose confidence in himself. And that was not all. She pointedly reminded him that George and Charlotte had also been deeply affected by the silence. George had started anxiously paying attention to every single closed door in the house. Charlotte had learned to automatically lower her voice whenever Louis was mentioned. She had even begun leaving little jokes on his bed because she had figured out all by herself that making him laugh helped bring back the happy brother she knew. So that night, William and Catherine finally reached an important, unified turning point together. Catherine would speak out, but only to a certain, defined point. She had absolutely no intention of sharing every private medical detail of what their family had been through. At the same time, she was no longer willing to pretend that the past several months had been easy or normal, and that is when everything started to truly change. Even after they finally agreed on what they wanted to say, there was still one highly powerful person who had the authority to stop the entire statement from being released. Ironically, he was also the one person in the broader family who truly understood what they were going through. That person was King Charles. Later that evening, Charles received the revised draft after one of his regular late-night briefings. Before reading it, he quietly asked everyone else to leave the room. Then he sat entirely alone and carefully read every single page. When he finished, he went back and read it all over again. But then something specific caught his attention. He reached the heartbreaking line that talked about a child confusing privacy with shame. He slowly took off his glasses, gently placed them on the heavy desk, and sat there for several long moments without touching them again. There was a profound reason that specific sentence affected him so deeply. Charles had spent his entire life trapped inside a rigid royal system that actively teaches people to hide their true feelings before they are even old enough to understand what that kind of suffocating silence can cost a soul. He learned that harsh lesson as a lonely child. Later, he passed the exact same damaging lesson on to his own sons. And as the world knows all too well, one of those sons has spent the last 20 years speaking very openly and angrily about the deep emotional damage that specific approach caused. And this is where the conversation between monarch and heir became even more serious. Charles asked his son just one piercing question. Was this highly personal statement truly meant to help Prince Louis, or was it simply making the guilty adults around him feel better about their choices? It was a very difficult, challenging question to hear, but it was also the undeniably right one. Every loving family believes it is fiercely protecting its child during hard times. But sometimes, completely without realizing it, the adults are actually just protecting themselves from having to say painful, difficult things out loud. But there was one important, glaring difference in the palace's edited version. They had completely removed the part where Prince Louis thanked the ordinary people who had supported him. In fact, they had ruthlessly taken out the only sentence in the entire drafted statement that truly sounded like it came from the young prince himself. And that realization became the deciding moment. Charles flatly refused to approve the heavily edited, sanitized version. According to someone who witnessed the intense discussion, the king firmly believed that removing Louis's own words might protect the dignity of the monarchy, but it would fundamentally fail the child at the center of the story. And that is really the whole tragic situation summarized in one sentence. The entire royal system, all the highly paid advisors, all the carefully worded press statements, all the 10-year media plans and strategies, they were all meticulously designed to protect the institution of the monarchy. But somewhere along the way, protecting the monarchy and protecting the actual child became two completely different, conflicting things. The silence that was supposed to keep Louis safe ended up making him feel terribly isolated. The privacy that was supposed to shield him from public scrutiny ended up making him question whether he was truly loved. And the adults in the room, all of them undeniably well-intentioned, all of them genuinely trying to do the right thing, ended up creating the absolute worst outcome they were trying to avoid. Not because they didn't care deeply, but because they were so intensely focused on controlling the media story that they completely forgot to explain the reality to the one person who needed to hear it most. An 8-year-old boy who just desperately wanted to know that he wasn't the problem. That is the part that makes Catherine's tears make complete sense. That is the part that makes the whole polished video feel so incredibly raw and real. And that is the part that is going to stay with people long after the sensational headlines fade away. And if you look closely at the way Catherine handled the actual video recording, you can see how incredibly carefully she balanced two completely different, competing responsibilities. On one side, she was speaking as a heartbroken mother who had helplessly watched her youngest child slowly withdraw into himself. On the other side, she was speaking as a senior member of the royal family who knew every single word would be endlessly analyzed by the global press for years to come. She didn't mention highly specific medical incidents. She didn't describe private, painful conversations in unnecessary detail. She didn't give the ravenous press a single sensational quote they could easily twist into a damaging tabloid headline. But she also didn't hide cowardly behind meaningless PR phrases like difficult period or challenging time without explaining why it was so challenging. She bravely named the emotion. She said the powerful word shame. She described vividly what it looked like when a child mistakenly believes he is the reason his family is hiding him away. That is not a standard, boring royal communication. That is a fierce mother drawing one clear, unyielding line between what the public deserves to know and what her vulnerable son deserves to keep private. And the response from the British public was immediate and striking. People who had spent months casually speculating online about Louis suddenly went very quiet. The cruel internet jokes stopped. The wild conspiracy theories stopped. The comment sections that had been full of wild, invasive guesses turned into something significantly closer to collective guilt. Because until that very moment, most people hadn't paused to consider what their relentless curiosity might feel like from the inside of the palace walls. They hadn't thought about what it would be like to be 8 years old and realize that millions of strangers were aggressively asking why you weren't showing up to events. They hadn't imagined what it would feel like to walk past a television and hear your own name being discussed by news anchors in somber tones, usually reserved for bad news. Catherine's statement didn't just explain what had been happening. It forced ordinary people to sit uncomfortably with their own role in the frenzy. And that is a much harder, braver thing to do than simply releasing a statement saying, "Leave him alone." There is also something deeply important in the way William eventually supported the brave decision. He didn't issue his own competing statement. He didn't stand physically beside Catherine in front of the cameras to share the spotlight or add his own words to the release. He simply let her speak, and then he stayed quiet. For a man who has spent most of his adult life desperately trying to control every single narrative around his family, that was a massive, significant shift. It suggested that he finally understood something he hadn't fully accepted before. You can't always protect your children by saying absolutely nothing. Sometimes the most fiercely protective thing you can do is tell the unvarnished truth in a way that leaves absolutely no room for anyone else to invent a worse, more damaging version. William has always been deeply afraid of what happens when private pain becomes public property. But in this specific case, he seems to have realized that the prolonged silence had already made Lewis's pain a public issue. The only difference was that the public's version of the story was completely wrong, and for Lewis himself, the profound hope is that this becomes the pivotal moment everything starts to turn around. Children are incredibly resilient, but they are also deeply, quietly observant. He will undoubtedly remember the dark months when he thought he was the problem. He will remember the confusing feeling of walking into a room and watching beloved adults abruptly change the subject. But he will also always remember that his mother eventually sat down in front of a camera and bravely told the entire world that he was deeply loved, that he was absolutely not the problem, and that his family had never, ever been ashamed of him. That is a tremendously powerful thing for any child to hear, even if it happens in a way that is far more public than anyone would ever choose. And if the palace is careful moving forward, if the senior advisors learn the right vital lesson from all of this heartache, then maybe the next few months will be about something far more important than mere damage control. Maybe they will be about genuinely rebuilding trust, not just between the royal family and the demanding public, but far more importantly, between Lewis and the people who love him most. Because at the end of the day, that is what this story is actually about. Not the future of the monarchy, not the ravenous media, not the endless strategy meetings or the carefully worded press statements. It is about a little boy who spent months tragically believing something that wasn't true, and the beautiful moment his mother finally said the truth out loud so he could hear it too. The tears weren't shed for the cameras. They weren't performed for public sympathy. They were shed for Lewis. And if there is any justice in the way this complex situation plays out, he will never have to doubt his place in his family again.